The morning sun peeked through the windows of the Blue Plate Diner as Mai wiped down the counter for the 100th time that day. Steam rose from the coffee maker behind her, and the familiar scent of pancakes and bacon wafted from the kitchen. Her fingers moved in a practiced pattern across the surface. Tap, tap, slide, a rhythm that matched the classical melody playing in her head. "Order up," called Ray from the kitchen, his voice mixing with the clinking of plates and murmur of early morning conversations. May quickly grabbed the plates, balancing them with the grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. As she served breakfast to the customers in booth 3, her mind wandered to the piece she'd been practicing in her tiny apartment the night before. The diner wasn't fancy, just your regular hometown place with slightly worn leather booths and coffee cups that had seen better days. But to May, even the soft whir of the ceiling fans had its own music. She'd catch herself conducting with her pen while taking orders, turning the everyday symphony of diner sounds into her personal orchestra. Between refilling coffee cups and jotting down orders, May snuck glances at her phone, where she kept her piano theory notes hidden among her shopping lists. She'd taught herself to play over the years, practicing on an old keyboard she'd found at a yard sale. The kitchen staff thought she was just checking messages, but her fingers were actually tracing invisible scales on the edge of her order pad. In booth 7 sat Mr. Lee, a quiet elderly man who came in every morning at exactly 7:15. He always ordered the same thing: 1 egg over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee. There was something different about the way he watched her work, as if he could see past her waitress uniform to something else entirely. The morning rush kept Mai on her toes. A group of construction workers came in, their boots leaving muddy tracks on the freshly mopped floor. A young mom struggled to keep her toddler from throwing crayons while trying to order. Through it all, Mai moved with a rhythm that seemed to flow naturally, her steps between tables like a carefully choreographed dance. During a rare quiet moment, she caught herself humming Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata while arranging sugar packets. Her coworker, Jade, shot her an amused look. "Girl, you're always humming something fancy. Where do you even learn those tunes?" May just smiled and shrugged, turning away to hide the flush in her cheeks. Her love for classical piano was her precious secret, one that seemed too fragile to share in the bustling world of bottomless coffee cups and greasy spoons. The diner's ancient jukebox played old country songs in the background, but in Me's mind, she transformed them into complex piano arrangements. She'd mentally add flourishes to the simple melodies, turning Willie Nelson into Chopin, while she counted out change and wrote up bills. As her double shift stretched on, May's feet ached and her back complained, but her fingers never stopped their silent practice. Even as she loaded plates into the industrial dishwasher, she was working on her fingering, using the edge of the metal sink as her practice keyboard. Years of watching online tutorials and studying theory books from the library had taught her to find music in the most unlikely places. The day wound down like any other, wiping tables, restocking condiments, counting tips. But tomorrow held a promise that none of her customers knew about. Tomorrow was her day off, and in the early morning hours before the rest of the world woke up, she had a secret date with an old upright piano tucked away in the diner's forgotten party room. For now, though, she continued her daily routine, a hidden artist among the coffee stains and dinner specials. As the sun set outside the diner's windows, Mai hummed softly to herself, her simple waitress uniform concealing the heart of a musician whose greatest performances were yet to come. Mr. Lee wasn't just any regular customer at the Blue Plate Diner. Behind his quiet demeanor and simple breakfast order lay 40 years of experience as a concert pianist and music teacher. He performed in grand concert halls across the world, but now, in his retirement, he found himself drawn to this small-town diner for reasons beyond the perfectly cooked eggs. Every morning, he watched the young waitress, Me, as she moved through the diner with an unmistakable grace that caught his trained eye. It wasn't just the way she carried plates or poured coffee. It was the subtle details that spoke volumes to someone who knew what to look for. Her fingers would dance across the counter in precise patterns while she waited for orders. Sometimes, when business was slow, she'd tap out complex rhythms on her notepad that he recognized from Tchaikovsky's compositions. The humming under her breath wasn't random tunes. They were precise segments of classical pieces, perfectly pitched even among the clatter of dishes and conversation. One particularly busy morning, he noticed how she handled a crisis. 3 orders arriving simultaneously while a child spilled orange juice at another table. Her response wasn't chaos. It was more like a conductor managing different sections of an orchestra. Each movement was calculated, efficient, yet flowing into the next with natural harmony. Mr. Lee took to arriving earlier each day, choosing his usual spot in booth 7 where he could observe without being obvious. He brought his reading glasses and newspaper, but his attention was really on the small details. The way Mi's hand movements matched the tempo of classical pieces he knew by heart. How she'd close her eyes for just a moment when the radio played anything remotely classical. The other regulars noticed nothing unusual about her. To them, she was just a hard-working waitress who always remembered their usual orders and kept their coffee cups full. But Mr. Lee saw the calluses on her fingers, not just from carrying plates, but the distinctive marks of someone who spent hours practicing on piano keys. He'd overheard snippets of conversation between Mi and her coworkers. When they discussed weekend plans, hers always seemed vague, just staying in or catching up on some things. He recognized the polite deflections of someone protecting precious practice time. One rainy Tuesday, he noticed her reading something on her phone during a quiet moment. From his angle, he caught a glimpse of sheet music on the screen before she quickly tucked it away. The piece was Chopin's Nocturne, not exactly casual reading for someone who didn't play. As weeks passed, Mr. Lee began bringing his own small notebook, jotting down his observations. Not in a creepy way, but with the careful attention of someone who recognized raw talent hiding in plain sight. He noted how she'd correct her posture unconsciously, maintaining the straight back of a pianist, even during the longest shifts. The other customers came and went, but he remained, nursing his coffee and watching this unknowing performer in her daily concert. He saw how she'd brighten whenever classical music came on the radio, how her movements would subtly align with the tempo, how she'd sometimes mouth the names of notes to herself while restocking supplies. What amazed him most was how she transformed the mundane rhythms of diner work into music. The way she'd time her steps between tables, the rhythm of her swiping the counter, even how she stacked plates. Everything had a musical quality to it that probably even she didn't realize. The question wasn't if she played piano, but how well and under what circumstances she'd learned. Mr. Lee had taught hundreds of students over his career, but there was something special in how Mi's music seemed to flow from everyday movements, unselfconscious and pure. As autumn turned the leaves outside the diner windows golden, Mr. Lee continued his quiet observation, waiting for the right moment to speak up. He knew that talent like hers needed nurturing, but he also understood the delicacy of the situation. For now, he was content to watch this hidden musician play her silent symphony among the coffee cups and breakfast specials, knowing that someday the right moment would come to help her talent truly shine. The early morning silence at the Blue Plate Diner held a different kind of magic. Before the first pot of coffee brewed, before the griddle sizzled with breakfast orders, Mai had the whole place to herself. She'd come in extra early that day, using her spare key to slip in while the sky was still dark. The autumn air was crisp as she moved through the shadowy diner, not bothering to turn on all the lights. Her footsteps echoed slightly as she made her way to the back of the building, past the storage room, toward the old party room that hadn't been used for real events in years. There, covered in a faded cloth, stood her secret joy, an old upright piano from the diner's past life as a jazz club. The wood was scratched, and some of the keys had yellowed with age, but to Mai, it was more beautiful than any grand piano she'd seen in pictures. She discovered it by accident months ago while doing inventory. Since then, these early morning moments had become her own private concert hall. Carefully, she pulled back the cloth, trying not to stir up too much dust. The familiar smell of aged wood and worn ivory keys welcomed her like an old friend. Mai sat down on the creaky piano bench, taking a deep breath. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before beginning their dance. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the empty diner, soft and hesitant at first, then growing more confident with each measure. She taught herself this piece by watching countless online videos, practicing on her cheap keyboard at home until her neighbors complained. But here, on this old piano, the music came alive in a way her keyboard could never capture. Her fingers found the familiar path through the melody, letting emotion flow through each note. Lost in the music, she didn't hear the front door's quiet click or the soft footsteps approaching. The piece had taken her somewhere else entirely, away from bills and double shifts and tired feet. In these moments, she wasn't just a waitress. She was every dream she'd ever had of becoming something more. The final notes were just fading into the morning silence when a voice spoke from the doorway. Remarkable. Mai jumped up from the bench, her heart racing. There stood Mr. Lee, his eyes bright with something she couldn't quite read. How long had he been standing there? Her cheeks burned with embarrassment at being discovered. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, reaching for the dust cloth. "I know I shouldn't be using this piano. I was just—" "Please." Mr. Lee held up his hand gently. "Don't stop on my account. Your interpretation of Chopin. It's quite moving." Mai stood frozen, one hand still on the piano's lid. She'd kept her passion for piano secret for so long, and now here was a customer, her quiet regular, catching her in this private moment. "How long?" he asked softly, stepping into the room. "How long have you been playing?" Mai hesitated, then straightened her shoulders slightly. "About 6 years. Teaching myself, mostly. Internet videos, library books, whatever I could find." Mr. Lee nodded, moving closer to examine the piano. His fingers traced the wood with familiar ease. "Self-taught? That makes it even more impressive. Your technique needs refinement, yes, but your emotional understanding of the piece." He smiled warmly. "That's something that can't be taught." The morning light was starting to creep through the windows now, painting the room in soft shades of gold. Mai's heart was still racing, but for a different reason now. The way Mr. Lee spoke about music, the way he carried himself as he looked at the piano. There was something there she recognized from her countless hours of watching great pianists online. "Would you?" she started, then found her courage. "Would you like to hear another piece?" His smile widened as he gestured to the bench. "Nothing would make me happier." As Mai sat back down at the piano, her fingers returning to the keys, she felt something shift in the air around her. This moment, in the quiet dawn at a small-town diner, felt like the beginning of something new. The music rose once again, filling the space with possibilities neither of them had expected to find that morning. The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the diner's windows as Mai and Mr. Lee sat in his usual booth, two untouched cups of coffee between them. The revelation he just shared left her stunned. This quiet man, who'd ordered the same breakfast for months, was actually a retired concert pianist who'd performed in venues she'd only dreamed about. "I don't understand," Mai said, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Mr. Lee's eyes crinkled with warmth. "Talent like yours is like a wild flower. It needs to grow in its own time. I wanted to be sure." The diner's owner, Mrs. Wu, was wiping down nearby tables, pretending not to listen but clearly catching every word. She'd known about Mai's early morning piano sessions. It was hard to keep secrets in a place this small, but had never mentioned it. Understanding some dreams need privacy to grow. "I've taught at the finest music schools," Mr. Lee continued, his voice gentle but filled with purpose. "I've worked with hundreds of students, but there's something special in how you play. You have what we call raw talent, unpolished but pure. With proper training, he paused, letting the possibility hang in the air. Mi's hands tightened around her coffee cup. I can't afford lessons, she said quietly. I'm barely making rent as it is. Money isn't the issue. Mr. Lee shook his head. I'm retired, and teaching one promising student would be a pleasure, not a burden. What I'm offering is a chance to develop your gift properly. Mrs. Wu finally gave up pretending not to listen and approached their table. You should do it, she said, surprising them both. I've heard you playing in the mornings, you know. Always wondered when someone would notice. Mai looked up at her boss in surprise. You knew? Of course I knew. Who do you think kept that piano tuned? Mrs. Wu laughed, then grew serious. Listen, we can adjust your schedule. Maybe switch some shifts around. But Mi's mind was already racing with doubts. Years of keeping her dreams private made them feel fragile, like soap bubbles that might pop if exposed to too much light. I don't know. I'm not properly trained. I probably have so many bad habits. That's exactly why you need guidance now, Mr. Lee said firmly. Before those habits become too ingrained. You've done remarkably well on your own, but imagine what you could achieve with proper instruction. The early morning regulars were starting to trickle in, the bell above the door chiming softly. Mai watched them take their usual seats, everything still normal, while her world was tilting on its axis. I could teach you proper technique, theory, composition, Mr. Lee continued. We could start with weekly lessons, see how it goes. No pressure, no expectations beyond doing your best. Mrs. Wu put her hand on Mi's shoulder. Sometimes life gives us a chance we didn't expect. My mother always said it's better to try and fail than wonder, what if forever. Mai looked down at her hands, server's hands, calloused from carrying plates and wiping tables, but also a pianist's hands, strong from countless hours of practice. She thought about her tiny apartment, the keyboard she'd covered with a sheet because it felt too painful to look at sometimes, knowing she might never progress beyond teaching herself. Could we start slowly? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to let anyone down. Mr. Lee's face softened. The only person you need to worry about is yourself. Music isn't a race, it's a journey. We'll take it one note at a time. Mrs. Wu clapped her hands decisively. It's settled then. You can use the party room for lessons. That old piano should be played by someone who loves it. We'll work out the scheduled details later. The morning sun caught the chrome trim of the diner's counter, sending little sparkles of light dancing across the walls. Mai watched them, remembering how she used to imagine they were musical notes floating in the air. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to let her private dream step into the light. Okay, she said finally, a mix of terror and excitement fluttering in her chest. Yes, I'd like to try. The smile that spread across Mr. Lee's face was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Excellent. We'll begin tomorrow morning, right here. Bring all your questions, all your dreams. It's time to make them real. The sound of frustrated scales filled the diner's party room as early morning light crept through the windows. Mi's fingers stumbled over the same passage for the 10th time, and she fought the urge to slam the piano lid in defeat. 3 weeks into her lessons with Mr. Lee, and she felt like she was starting all over again. Again, Mr. Lee said gently, but this time, watch your thumb crossing. You're tensing up right before the shift. Mai took a deep breath and started again. The simple scales she'd thought she'd mastered now felt foreign under his careful instruction. Everything she'd taught herself needed to be relearned, her posture, her finger positioning, even the way she sat at the piano. Later that morning, during her shift, she dropped a plate while trying to flex her tired fingers. The crash drew everyone's attention, and her cheeks burned as she cleaned up the mess. Her coworker, Lin, rushed to help. You okay? Lin asked, sweeping up the broken pieces. You seem really tired lately. I'm fine. Maya smiled weakly, though her hands were shaking slightly. She'd been up since 4 a.m. practicing, then had lessons before her shift, and would practice again after work. The schedule was beginning to take its toll. During her break, she sat in the back office, icing her wrists and reviewing the music theory worksheets Mr. Lee had given her. The notes swam before her eyes as fatigue set in. Outside, she could hear the busy lunch rush starting, knowing she'd have to get back out there soon. Mrs. Wu found her there, half asleep over her practice sheets. "You know," she said, setting down a cup of hot tea, "when I was young, my mother wanted me to learn traditional Chinese dance. I practiced so hard I made myself sick. Sometimes moving slower means getting there faster." Mai wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the steam rise to her tired face. "But there's so much to learn. Mr. Lee is trying to get me ready for an audition at the conservatory. They're having special considerations for late entry students, but the deadline is in 4 months. And you think running yourself into the ground will help?" Mrs. Wu raised an eyebrow. "What good is an audition if you're too exhausted to play?" That evening, after her shift, May returned to the party room. Mr. Lee was already there, arranging sheet music. His expression changed when he saw her exhausted face. "Perhaps we should take a break today," he suggested, but May shook her head. "No, I can do this. Please." She sat at the piano, flexing her tired fingers. Mr. Lee was quiet for a moment, then sat down beside her on the bench. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "When I was first learning piano, I practiced until my fingers bled. I thought that was what dedication meant. My teacher found me one day, crying over the keys because I couldn't feel them anymore." Mai looked at her own hands, the calluses building up in new places, the slight tremor in her fingers. "You know what she told me?" Mr. Lee continued. "She said music isn't just in our hands. It's in our hearts, our minds, our souls. If we exhaust one, we dim them all." He reached over and played a simple melody, one May recognized from her childhood. Sometimes we need to step back and remember why we fell in love with music in the first place. Tears welled up in Mi's eyes as the familiar tune filled the room. "I'm just so afraid of failing," she whispered. "This chance, it means everything." "No," Mr. Lee corrected gently. "You mean everything. The music is already inside you. We're just helping it find its way out." That night, instead of practicing until midnight, May went home early. She made herself a proper dinner, took a long shower, and for the first time in weeks, just listened to music for pleasure. As she drifted off to sleep, she realized the melody in her head wasn't one of her practice pieces. It was something new, something uniquely hers. The next morning, she arrived at the diner with clearer eyes and steadier hands. When she sat down at the piano, Mr. Lee noticed the difference immediately. "Now," he smiled, "you're ready to really begin." It started with the phone. One of the younger customers had been filming their friend's birthday celebration in the diner when they caught something unexpected in the background. The sound of piano music drifting from the party room during Mi's break. Curious, they had followed the music and quietly recorded her playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. By the time Mi discovered the video online, it had already gained thousands of views. Comments poured in, amazed by the waitress in her blue uniform creating such beautiful music in an old diner. Some were kind, full of encouragement and praise. Others were harsh, pointing out technical flaws and questioning her training. "Don't read the comments," Mrs. Wu warned, trying to take Mi's phone away during her shift. But it was too late. The words had already burrowed under her skin, making her doubt every note she played. The local newspaper caught wind of the story. A reporter showed up during the lunch rush, asking questions and taking photos without permission. Mai fled to the kitchen, hands shaking so badly she could barely hold a plate. "You don't have to talk to them," Mrs. Wu said firmly, shooing the reporter away. But word had spread. More people started coming to the diner, hoping to catch a glimpse of the piano waitress. Some even requested performances, as if she were some kind of entertainment act. That evening, during her lesson with Mr. Lee, Mai couldn't focus. Her fingers kept slipping on a particularly challenging piece they'd been working on for her upcoming audition. "I can't do this," she said finally, pulling her hands away from the keys. "Everyone's watching now, waiting for me to fail." Mr. Lee was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Why do you play?" "What?" "Why do you play the piano? Not why did you start, but why do you continue?" Maya stared at the keys, thinking about those early mornings alone with the old piano, about the peace she found in the music before anyone else knew about it. Because when I play, I feel like myself, like I'm speaking in my true voice." "Then that's all that matters," he said simply. "The rest is just noise." But the pressure continued to build. During her shifts, Mai became increasingly self-conscious. Every movement felt watched, judged. She started taking her breaks in the storage room instead of playing, the weight of expectations too heavy on her shoulders. One particularly difficult day, after a customer complained about cold food because Mai had been distracted thinking about her upcoming audition, she reached her breaking point. In the middle of her shift, she untied her apron and walked out the back door into the alley behind the diner. The cool air hit her face as she slid down the wall, finally letting the tears come. All her dreams of becoming a real pianist seemed to be crumbling. Maybe she was fooling herself. Maybe she should just stick to serving coffee and stop reaching for something more. She didn't hear the door open, but suddenly there was Lynn sitting beside her. And then Mrs. Wu and even the cook joined them. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city floating around them. "You know," Lynn said finally, "before all this happened, I used to love listening to you practice in the mornings while I set up. It made everything feel magical somehow." "Remember when the power went out during that storm?" The cook added. "You play for everyone by candlelight." Made them forget they were stuck in a diner with no electricity. Mrs. Wu took Mi's hand. "We're not just your coworkers, we're your family. And family supports each other, no matter what." From inside, they could hear customers asking for her. But instead of feeling pressured, Maya suddenly felt strengthened by their concern. These were the people who had heard her play when no one else knew, who had protected her secret until she was ready to share it. Standing up, Mag brushed off her uniform and took a deep breath. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm ready to go back in." "And?" Mrs. Wu prompted gently. "And maybe I'll play something. Not because they want me to, but because I want to." As they walked back inside together, Mai felt something shift inside her. The weight of others' expectations began to lift, replaced by the simple joy of sharing her music with people who truly cared. The morning of the conservatory audition dawned crisp and clear. Mai stood outside the impressive building, her hands tucked into her coat pockets to keep them warm. The sheet music in her bag felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Mr. Lee stood beside her, a steady presence in the early morning light. "Remember," he said softly, "you're not just playing for them. You're playing for yourself." The practice room they assigned her for warm-up had a grand piano that probably cost more than she'd make in 10 years at the diner. As she sat down, her reflection in its polished surface showed someone she barely recognized, not quite the waitress anymore, but not yet the musician she hoped to become. While she warmed up, her mind drifted to the previous night at the diner. Mrs. Wu had closed early for a special event, a practice performance for Mai's family. The regular customers, her coworkers, even the delivery guy who always brought their supplies, they'd all squeezed into the party room to hear her play. She performed her audition pieces for them, and instead of the nervous tension she'd expected to feel, she found herself relaxing into the music. These people had seen her at her best and worst, had supported her journey from the beginning. Their presence felt like a warm embrace. Now, sitting in the austere practice room, she drew strength from those memories. When the door opened and a staff member called her name, she stood up straight, channeling the confidence she'd found the night before. The audition room was larger than she expected, with tall windows letting in streams of morning light. 3 judges sat at a table, their faces neutral as they reviewed her application. The grand piano waited center stage, its lid raised like a black wing. "You may begin when ready," one judge said, her voice echoing slightly in the large room. Mai sat down at the piano, adjusting the bench with practiced ease. She'd prepared the required classical pieces, a Bach prelude, a Chopin nocturne. But for her final piece, she'd made a bold choice. The first notes of Bach filled the room, her fingers finding their way through the familiar patterns. As she played, she thought about her journey. All those early mornings practicing alone, the hours spent with Mr. Lee rebuilding her technique from the ground up, the endless cups of coffee that had fueled her dreams. When she finished the classical pieces, she took a deep breath. "For my final selection," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, "I'd like to play an original composition." The judges looked up from their notes, interest flickering across their faces. "It's called Morning Symphony at the Blue Plate," she continued. "It's about finding music in unexpected places." Her fingers touched the keys, and the piece began softly, like early morning light creeping through diner windows. The melody wove together the sounds of her daily life. The rhythm of coffee cups clinking against saucers, the harmonic hum of conversation, the syncopated dance of footsteps during the breakfast rush. As the piece built, she added layers of complexity, the jazz-like improvisation of handling multiple orders, the steady bassline of routine transformed into something beautiful. All the things she'd learned from years of balancing plates and dreams came pouring out through her fingers. The final section incorporated fragments of classical pieces, hints of Chopin and Bach appearing like familiar faces in a crowd, before resolving into a hopeful, rising melody that felt like sunrise over the city. When the last note faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Mee kept her hands on the keys, heart pounding. Then one of the judges cleared their throat. "That was unexpected," they said, but there was warmth in their voice. "Thank you, Ms. Chen." Walking out of the building later, Mr. Lee waiting anxiously by the steps, Mai felt lighter somehow. Whatever the outcome, she knew she'd played her truth. Not just the musician she hoped to become, but also the waitress who'd found music in the everyday symphony of life. 2 weeks later, when the acceptance letter arrived at the diner, the celebration lasted all day. Mrs. Wu hung the letter on the wall next to the specials board. Customers ordered extra slices of pie in May's honor. Lin kept hugging her between orders. That evening, after the party, Mai sat alone at the old upright piano in the party room. Her fingers found the keys in the dimming light, playing softly. The music wasn't practice now, or performance. It was simply joy, flowing freely in the quiet diner that had become her first concert hall. She would start classes soon, beginning a new chapter of her journey. But she knew that part of her would always belong here, where coffee cups clinked like quiet percussion and dreams were served alongside the daily special.